Hello and welcome into another episode of Preps to Pros. I'm Cooper Petagna alongside Andrew Ivins, and the boys are still recovering from a long week in Nashville last week at the Personnel Symposium. Hopefully you caught our show this past week. But Drew, you were busy this weekend. You had some media days and also always staying busy in the state of Florida. But we got a great show for you today. We're going to get into it with the Andrew Ivins Juice segment. A lot of commitments over the last week since we last saw you as well. We're going to get into some over-under win totals in the regular season for the top five teams in the preseason AP via Brad Crawford, and then also some final thoughts. I'm going to be talking a little bit about Jordan Davis, Nyckoles Harbor, setting a personal record in the 100-meter. Drew fired up about that one. But Drew, how you doing, my man?
I'm doing good, man. You know, it never stops. Busy weekend. We had some commitments. I mean, I'm just wondering, is there anyone going to be left for signing day, or is everyone going to be off the board and me and you are just going to have a nice little showdown in Fort Lauderdale or wherever where we don't really talk about anything?
Well, we brought that up kind of recently. I think I brought that up on Twitter not too long ago. But as it stands right now, 191 of the top 247 committed and off the board before the December signing period. That is over 75%, I believe. So that just goes to show where we are in the process, how things have accelerated. But Drew, let's jump right into it. Start with some juice. And a guy that we've talked a lot about, top 247 receiver Keem Williams. I saw you interviewed him over the weekend. It sounds like things are starting to move in the direction of a decision. What are you hearing on him?
Yeah, last Wednesday I brought up that Keem was going to move up the timeline, and he hasn't gone public yet and released his commitment date. But I think the end of September is when Keem Williams is going to make some type of decision and announce it to the world. I caught up with him Saturday at a media day down here in South Florida, and we just were going through his schools. He told me he's going to take two unofficial visits in September. He's going to get to Pittsburgh on September 10th. They play Tennessee. And then that following weekend, he's going to be probably at one of the games of the year, Texas A&M hosting Miami the weekend of September 17th. So he's going to take two more unofficial visits. I think a decision comes after that. My crystal ball right now is on the Aggies for Keem Williams. I still like Texas A&M here. You know how Jimbo Fisher and co recruited last cycle, but I do think Florida State, Pittsburgh, they've kind of closed that gap a little bit. And then, Miami is still lingering around. And I actually talked with someone at Miami this morning. Hurricanes trying to make a late push, but really I think it's Texas A&M followed by Pittsburgh and Florida State. And then you've got Georgia rounding out that top group right there. But this one's an interesting one. And, when Keem makes his decision, I don't think this one will be over. I think there's still going to be some twists and turns as we get later in the process.
I agree completely. He kind of stands out to me as one of those guys with a decision coming up, even if he commits, whether that's Texas A&M or one of these other programs, come December. This is a guy that I think, Drew, I think you're going to have your ear to the ground on him and what he has going on. I could see this playing out, especially when you talk about A&M, Miami, Georgia, some of the top programs in all of college football, sniffing around Keem Williams. And he is certainly one of the most dynamic players right now in five-star range in the top 32 of the top 247. But Drew, let's go to another guy, and a guy that you have loved throughout the evaluation process. That is top 247 defensive lineman Cameron James. It looks like he's starting to wind things down as well.
Yeah, the big man out of Olympia, he's a developmental type of prospect, a guy that shot up our rankings, and he really moved up a lot of recruiting boards for schools around the country. He hasn't officially named a top group of school or leaders or even set a commitment date, but I'm hearing that a decision could come soon and likely by the end of the upcoming weekend. And if that's the case, I think Florida is in line for some good news with Cameron James. We mentioned the size, weight, and speed all the time on this show. I mean, Cameron James checks off every box. There's footage of him out there running down the court and dunking the basketball. He took officials to Florida and Georgia in the month of June, returned to Florida for Friday Night Lights a few weeks ago. I saw him there walking around. He looked the part, but I like Florida here. My crystal ball is on the Gators heading into the start of his senior season. I think this would be a big get for Billy Napier and that staff. I mean, I've mentioned in the past, Florida, they want to rebuild that defensive line room, try to build it out like Georgia and Alabama have, and you need scheme versatile big bodies like Cameron James. Coop, I mean, I know you think this is a guy that could probably do a variety of things at the next level, correct?
Yeah, you talk about his size, 6'6", 265 pounds. I think when we saw him in February, he was a guy that kind of surprised me with the way that he could bend a little bit. And you see the majority of his tape at the 5 technique. I think he is scheme versatile. Like you said, I think he's a guy that ultimately will end up inside, probably playing as a 3 technique. But you mentioned Florida, you mentioned Georgia. That is good company to keep right there from Cameron James. And we're talking a little bit about the Gators. Some of the questions were up front and how they would address the defensive line. Now, Drew, there's another guy out there, top 247 defensive lineman, Kelby Collins as well, that it looks like Florida's in a good spot for.
Yeah, Kelby Collins, he's going to announce a commitment this weekend as well. You know, Florida, they have some momentum, have some footing in that recruitment, but Alabama's also involved, and you always got to keep an eye on the Crimson Tide. What's funny is Kelby Collins and Cameron James, you know, at Friday Night Lights, they didn't work out, but those two were just walking around. And I think Florida, they're really trying to sell the vision of, hey, we need to rebuild up front. We need to get this thing figured out. And Kelby Collins, who, you know, we listed him at 280 pounds. I mean, for a guy that weighs 280, just having sized him up in street clothes, like, man, you know, he looks the part. So Alabama, I think, is Florida's biggest competition, but I wouldn't be surprised if the Gators did get some good news, not only with Kelby Collins, but also Cameron James this upcoming weekend.
And Drew, we talked about the importance, and we talk a lot about Florida and the investment that Billy Napier made and his support staff really coming on the evaluation side of things. And we're starting to see this play out. I think they identified both Cameron James, Kelby Collins earlier in the process. I think Alabama and Georgia have kind of tagged along later, now making kind of pushes later in the process. But credit to Florida, Billy Napier and the staff that they have done on the job of those two guys and a countless number of others in their class. And that's allowed Florida really to establish one of the better footholds in the top 15 recruiting classes right now. And they're still rising, as Drew mentioned. But Drew, let's go to another top 247 defender. I would say this guy probably has the highest motor of any player. I think Peter Woods maybe rivals him there, the Clemson commit. But Reuben Bain, what are you hearing on him?
Well, if you total 29 sacks in a season, your motor runs very hot. And that is the case with Reuben Bain. I was actually with him on Saturday. He told me his goal is to get 40 sacks as a senior at Miami Central, which is obviously one of the most talented programs out there. You know, look, Reuben, everyone thinks he's a Miami lock. His brother's on staff as a graduate assistant working for Mario Cristobal. He's got an uncle that won a national title with the Hurricanes back in the late 80s. I think Alabama is the team to watch out here, watch out for with Reuben Bain. Yes, he likes the Hurricanes. Miami's going to get an official visit later in the process. But, you know, the more I think about it, the more I talk with people, if he's going to leave home, I think Alabama makes the most sense. And he's not going to have to face some people in his community and answer questions as to why he's getting away from home. I mean, kids for the past couple of years have left Florida, gone to Alabama, and got drafted. So I think Alabama is certainly a threat to Miami. With that being said, still like the Hurricanes. And I think two other schools you got to bring up with Reuben Bain. That'd be Auburn, the Auburn Tigers. You know, he brought up on his official visit, he sat down with Brian Harsin, and Harsin did a nice job of kind of silencing the outside noise. So I think he really liked that. A chance he could return to the Plains for an unofficial visit, potentially for that Penn State game, which is the whiteout game. And then with Oklahoma, they've been on him from the jump. You know, we always talk about it on this show, Brent Venables trying to rebuild that front seven, you know, get some pass rushers in there, make it look like Clemson. And I think Reuben Bain is a key part of that plan. So we'll see what happens. Decision not coming anytime soon for Reuben Bain, but someone will be getting a talented player down the line.
Auburn certainly starving for some momentum on the recruiting trail. Reuben Bain would deliver just that for them. Much needed momentum there. In Alabama, you talked about them. They lock in top 247 defensive lineman Hunter Osborne. They're in the mix for Keon Keeley, Notre Dame commit as well. So Alabama just getting started here as well. But Drew, let's go to another guy that in your neck of the woods we haven't really talked about much recently, but one of the better players in the country and a top 32 player at that. That is top 247 running back Cedric Baxter. He has a decision coming up this Wednesday, August 10th. What are you hearing on Cedric Baxter?
Oh, he's my favorite running back in the class of 2023. He's a guy that, you know, played a little safety early on in his career, played some wide receiver, and then kind of found his home at running back. And I love his running style. You know, look at him. He's pulling away from defenses here. He's physical. He can catch the ball out of the backfield. And I think he's taken his talents to Texas. Like you said, announcing a commitment on Wednesday night, you know, Miami, Florida, Texas A&M, they all took a swing at Mr. Cedric Baxter. But I think at the end, he's going to play for Texas, or they're at least going to pick up his commitment. And to me, this is kind of the arch effect. I was surprised by this when I looked it up. Cedric would be the highest ranked signee ever for the Longhorns out of the Sunshine State if he were to go ahead and sign with them, at least in the modern recruiting era. So it would be a huge win. And this is what happens when you get Arch Manning. This is what happens when he comes to Austin and he starts recruiting. And, Cooper, I was thinking about this. I mean, if you're Texas, you got to take everything you possibly can this cycle, right? You got to exhaust all your counters and sign 32 if you can, right? I mean, they're up to 21. Baxter would be 22. That means they got, 10 more spots?
Oh, that's a great point, especially coming off a 5-7 season. There's so much riding on this season. I think momentum-wise, it's really going to fall on the shoulders of what they get done this season. Right now, they can still kind of ride what you call the arch effect. And you think about what they've done at the receiver position, Jonte Cook, some of the other guys that they brought in via the transfer portal, Ajay Hall in Texas is certainly this appealing place. And then not to mention the cycle that they had last year on the offensive line, arguably the best cycle put together by offensive coordinator and offensive line coach Kyle Flood. So if you're Steve Sarkisian, I think you got to ride the hot hand here. And Drew, how about this? I'm going to dive into the archives a little bit, but the comparison always, since I've seen this guy, even before we started to hear the Texas rumblings, to me was Cedric Benson. Just looking at the build, the way they move, I think the suddenness in the play style, the way that they run, and his ability as a receiver out of the backfield as well kind of reminded me of him. So how about that, Drew? A little Texas comp for back then in the day and age right there. But Drew, let's go to the Top 247 commitment recap. A busy week. It seems like, all right, our last show is on Wednesday. By the time Monday rolls around, so much has happened, and there's a lot to get to. But I want to start with Lsu and Brian Kelly. And it's kind of interesting because we obviously focus a lot on the 3 Florida programs because you cover the state of Florida. But looking at LSU and the job that they've done, they're ranked number 7 right now in the 247 sports composite team rankings. And that's coming off of commitment of one of the best receivers in the country and a top 100 player and top 247 receiver, Shelton Sampson. And that's not to mention that quarterback and former Purdue commit, Ricky Collins, who's from the Baton Rouge area, is set to commit on Wednesday. Kylan Jackson, top 247 safety, was going to commit today. He has pushed that back to now August 13th. But you talk about 2 more Louisiana guys there, and they already have 5 in the class. I know not too long ago, me and you were kind of worried or maybe raising the question, hey, is this a potential issue for LSU in-state recruiting? What do you think so far of what Brian Kelly has done, and what have been your initial impressions so far at this point?
It feels different than previous LSU kind of recruiting strategies and tactics. This feels like it has a Notre Dame sprinkle to it in terms of Brian Kelly going out and getting his guys and having them all locked up before they even, put on the shoulder pads and square off with Florida State in New Orleans. So it just feels different. To me, I look at what LSU did last cycle. They didn't really sign any elite wide receivers. And you talk with some of these recruits. I mean, they think of LSU as wide receiver U. I mean, they got a bunch of guys in the NFL, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase. And so I think the fact that they get Shelton Sampson committed, tons of programs wanted him, and Jaylen Brown, those are the 2 highest ranked commits in their recruiting class right now. I think that's super impressive. I think Brian Kelly needed to do this, but it just feels different. I'm interested to see how it pans out. If they can hold on to these guys, I think that would be the case, but seems like a completely different strategy from what we saw under Ed Orgeron, where they were in some big heavyweight battles all the way up into December and January.
I think they've done a really good job, and we've talked about this with Billy Napier and the Florida Gators. I think both of these programs are pretty similar with their approach. They've done a really good job proactively on the identification and evaluation process, building up the floor of their roster in Baton Rouge. And we've mentioned, kind of talking to some of the guys in Baton Rouge, in Nashville last weekend, they mentioned how important it is for them really to harvest the talent in the state of Louisiana in the 6-hour, 300-mile radius. And then you look out in what they've done at the defensive back position. Ryan Yates from the state of Texas, Dalen Austin from California, and Jeremiah Hughes from Las Vegas right there at Bishop Gorman. So an interesting kind of, I would say, influx of talent from different areas is kind of the Brian Kelly Notre Dame approach per se. But LSU, certainly interesting, going to watch them. We talked a lot about week 1, Florida State, what that game means for both programs. LSU is certainly going to be a team to watch. But Drew, USC also getting in the mix. They add a top 247 defender in Braylon Shelby. Notre Dame also continuing to carry their number one ranked recruiting class. Jaden Osbury coming off the board, as along with Dylan Edwards, who was a guy that we got to see in Bradenton at the Future 50. Drew, any comments or any analysis on those guys?
Dylan Edwards, you had the Cedric Benson comp for Cedric Baxter. How about when we look at Dylan Edwards, Chris Tyree? I mean, Chris Tyree, current Notre Dame running back. We saw him multiple times on the camp circuit. I think it was two opening finals. He was named the fastest man. Well, Dylan Edwards, he was down at the Future 50. He rips off a 4.35 on the lasers to win the fastest man competition there. And I was talking with Tom Loy, our Notre Dame insider, and he kind of brought up that he thinks Dylan Edwards might be a little bit better than Chris Tyree, and I kind of agree with him when you pop on the tape. So I think that's an exciting addition for the Irish. Dylan Edwards at one time looked like he was headed to Kansas State. He rips off that 40. Doesn't take long for Marcus Freeman and co. to make easy work of it. The other one that stands out to me is Braylon Shelby going to USC. We keep talking about it. There's not a ton of big bodies out on the West Coast. And I think the fact that they get him in the boat is super impressive, because he's a guy that should be able to have a ton of success moving forward as they transition into the Big Ten. And I wish we had I told you guys you had the clip of it. Have you seen the clip of Braylon Shelby doing the triple jump at 235 pounds? He's running and bouncing. And I think he was a regional qualifier in Texas, which is pretty dang impressive, because it's super difficult to make it to states and advance in Texas, just given the mass amount of people there.
Somewhere Gabe Brooks is smiling that you have brought up the triple jump into this show, Drew. But Braylon Shelby, no, he was a dynamic guy. Just kind of watching the way that he moves. He's a natural mover at his size. You can play off ball. You can kind of play him off the edge a little bit. And you talk about USC. We've talked about why it's so important for them to go to places like Texas, Louisiana, and have success there when it comes to bigger bodies. They went down to Louisiana and got top 247 linebacker Tackett Curtis as well. So if you're Lincoln Riley, you like this approach. And I think as they trend towards the Big Ten here in the next year, this is what we're going to see more of from USC. And this is a really big get for them. But Drew, let's move on to another team. And I kind of wanted to ask you about this, but this is Miami. We talk a lot about Mario Cristobal, Alex Mirabal, the offensive line coach. They go out and they get one of the best interior offensive linemen in the country in Connor Lew from the state of Georgia, a 4-star. And listen, I like this guy a lot. And talking to a lot of staffs around the country, especially in the Southeast, they thought this was one of the better true center prospects in the class. But this is the 5th offensive lineman for Mario Cristobal. And obviously me working for him, I cannot say I'm surprised, but you still got top 247 in one of the best offensive linemen in the country, Samson Okunlola, out there as well. Mario used to call this what we like to call +1. So when he saw something he liked, especially on the offensive line, I think he was always going to have a little bit more difficult of a time turning those guys away. Drew, do you see this as a potential, I wouldn't say issue, but that room is starting to get a little bit crowded?
Well, I was going to ask you. I had it written down here. Ask Cooper about Mario Cristobal, essentially, getting as many offensive linemen as he has committed. Since 2017, Miami's only signed 5 offensive linemen in one recruiting class just once. Over that span, that 5-year span, they normally bring in just 2 or 3 offensive linemen. I think the average is 2.5 offensive linemen per class. So this is a complete 180 from what we've seen in the past under Manny Diaz, under Mark Richt. I mean, that's a position group that the Hurricanes just neglected. I go back to Zion Nelson when he started as a true freshman against Florida in a game where he graded out as like a 0.0 on PFF for pass blocking grade. So it's completely different. And Sampson's still out there. So, Cooper, what was the term you told me in Nashville? BPA, best player available. I mean, how many offensive linemen do you think Mario could take? Can we see him take 7 or 8? Because I think that's realistic. And he took guys in the transfer portal this offseason as well.
That's a great point. I would not be surprised. I think rule of thumb at the offensive line room, I think you want about 15 offensive linemen, and that would be the standard, right, across college football. I think coaches in schemes that favor more run-heavy offenses, you're going to see more of 16, 17 offensive linemen in a room. So I think Mario Cristobal is going to be heavy there. I'm not sure how much he likes currently what he has on his roster outside of Zion Nelson. So I'd be looking at it and listen, you're talking about the guys that he's bringing in. Francis Mauagoa, one of the best true tackles in the class. Tommy Kinsler is a guy that they love as well. And now you bring in Connor Lew, who's going to be the centerpiece of this. So much of what Mario Cristobal and Alex Mirabal like to do and what they have done at Oregon revolves around that center position. So for them to get the centerpiece to this, I know a lot of the conversation is going to start with Francis Mauigoa, as it should, but Connor Lew is a really big piece to this. And can you imagine Samson Okunlola playing opposite of Francis Mauigoa, and you got Connor Lew in the middle, and then Tommy Kinsler? It's another guy that they like a lot. So, no, I would not be surprised, to answer your question, if this class gets up to 6, maybe even 7 in the offensive line room, which is pretty crazy to think about. But
BPA, baby, right? Best player available.
BPA +1, brother. That's what we like to call it, a little +1. But let's go to Texas, and one of the more intriguing guys here coming off the board. We like Braylon Shelby a lot, but Darian Goulet, and this is going to be a guy that committed to Texas, top 247 edge rusher, who we like a lot. A guy that was a 3-phase player, playing a little bit smaller ball of competition, but was certainly a guy that has an excellent track and field background. He ends up is injuring his knee this offseason. He's going to be out the majority of his senior season, but I love the way that this guy fits. We talked a lot about why it's so important for Texas to address a lot of their needs on the defensive side of the ball, and I think this is a guy who's very dynamic. He just needs to find the fit in Pete Kwiatkowski's defense, but I love this kid.
Oh, I mean, it just goes back to what I just said a few minutes ago. I mean, if you're Texas, I would load up with as many guys as you can. And obviously, Darian is an in-state prospect. That's always going to give the Longhorns a good hard look. But you got to ride the Arch effect and load up with as many guys as you can. Cooper, I actually had this written down right here for you because you've been on the other side, right? You've been in a personnel department. How difficult does it become once a prospect gets injured with what could be a not career-ending injury, but something that's going to linger for a while? I always say it with knees, man. You could come back and not be the same, even with modern medicine and all these timelines. I mean, heck, Cam Akers 6 months after Achilles surgery was getting a carry in the Super Bowl. So I mean, just what are the staff in Austin thinking as they sit down and kind of discuss him in the war room?
Well, I think you have to monitor that. I mean, obviously information is key in terms of what you have access to. I remember we went through one of these situations with a player at the University of Washington that ended up tearing his ACL in his senior season, and we had our doctors working on it. He had his doctors working on it. I think you try to find a consensus and you try to find a plan going forward. But at this point, Darian Goulet is locked into the Texas Longhorns, and I tell you this, he is one of the most dynamic prospects in this class, and a guy that we truly love in terms of his versatility and his athletic upside. I think, developmental upside wise, he is one of the more intriguing players in this cycle. So I think if you're Texas, you're willing to be patient with a guy like Darian Goulet, because I think the payoff is going to be worth it for them. But certainly there's a lot of conversations. I don't think it's, hey, are we going to drop a player or not? Are we going to honor his commitment? I think it's more, hey, we want to make sure from the onset that each party is on the same page in terms of how we attack this and attack the rehab to make sure he's in the best position to make an impact once he arrives on campus. But Drew, last one here, and I kind of peeped this guy this morning, but Ohio State, it's a commitment from 4-star linebacker Arvell Reese from the state of Ohio. I don't know if you've got to watch this kid, but this was my first time getting eyes on him, and I'm like, okay, I'm excited to see his senior season.
I'm just eager, and I know we're going to get to it here in a little bit. What does Ohio State's defense look like under new defensive coordinator Jim Knowles? And they're going to play 3 safeties, a little bit different look, and not as many linebackers. And I think Arvell is an impressive take for them. It's been an interesting few weeks for Ohio State over on the recruiting trail. Dejon Johnson, he decommits. There's some rumors that he might be rejoining that Ohio State recruiting class. So I think this is some much needed good news for the Buckeyes.
You snuck in some mustard news on us right there in the Arvell Reese segment. But I like Arvell Reese, and I truly love the track record that Ohio State has in-state as well. So like this pickup for the Buckeyes. But, Drew, there's a couple other guys that I know you wanted to hit on. Micah Mays being one of them, one of your favorite players in the state of Florida. He ends up committing to Wake Forest, and then also a 3-star safety, Jeremiah England, as well, to Kentucky.
Yeah, Micah Mays. I actually had someone in a Power 5 recruiting department text me. Micah Mays to Wake Forest might be one of the biggest wins of the entire cycle, just kind of given what the program is and the type of prospect they were getting. I think A.T. Perry, the wide receiver for the Demon Deacons, who I think he was 3rd in the ACC in receiving yards last year. Micah Mays could be A.T. Perry 2.0. So I love that pickup. And then Jeremiah England, defensive back. He was our MVP of the National Combine back there in January. He was excellent out there. He's headed to Kentucky. And that's a big win, I think, for the Wildcats. I think a few weeks ago I said that Kentucky, coming off that 10-3 season, was a little bit disappointing on the recruiting trail, but they add Anglin, and I don't think they're done in the Sunshine State. They're also in a good position for Keaton Kirkland, a long, rangy defensive back out of the Jacksonville area. So Kentucky slowly rising up in the rankings.
Shout out to Wake Forest. I know how much you love Micah Mays throughout the evaluation process. That's a big one for Dave Clawson and the Deeks. But Drew, let's get the hammer out and let's go to the over-under. This is something that we're going to enjoy a lot, and I'm glad we're going to keep doing this. But we're going to do the over-under regular season win totals for the top 5 teams preseason, according to our own Brad Crawford. He did a story on this not too long ago. So if we will find a way to get that to you on 247 Sports. But Drew, we're going to start with Alabama, the number 1 ranked team here in the preseason. According to Brad Crawford, their win total over under is 11. And I'll start, Drew. I'm going to take that hammer out. I'm going to smash this. I see a perfect season for Alabama. Everything they have coming back, the Heisman winner, Bryce Young, Will Anderson, arguably the best player in the country, the best defensive player in the country. Jordan Battle is back as well. This team, to me, is a team on a mission. And you heard it. I mean, you talked about Nick Saban talking about, hey, last year was a rebuilding year with an appearance in the national championship. So to me, you start to kind of get the hints throughout the offseason. I think Alabama is going to be a very focused team. I have them going undefeated with a 12-0 spotless record in the regular season.
Yeah, now just to clarify, this is regular season, right? So they got 12 games. You're saying they're going to win 11 or get to 12. And I'm going to agree with you. I'm going over as well. Pete Golding, the defensive coordinator for the Crimson Tide, he had an interesting comment a few days ago, said that Alabama, for the first time, he feels like he has leaders at all 3 levels of his defense. So the defensive line, linebackers, and then obviously in that secondary. That's something that sticks with me. I've also heard this offseason that we always talk about Will Anderson, the all-world, the edge rusher. I had someone in that building tell me that they think Dallas Turner could have more sacks this season than Will Anderson. That might be a product of teams playing Will Anderson one way, but Dallas Turner, I expect a big step from him. And, Cooper, one other thing I was thinking about, having a conversation with some of my buddies about Heisman futures, and, I'm like, I don't really like anything on the board. Bryce Young, I don't like Jahmyr Gibbs. Why isn't there an Alabama wide receiver? I can't get odds on Ja'Cory Brooks to win the Heisman. I'm not campaigning for it, but I think that's worth a flyer. I mean, someone's got to catch the ball from Bryce Young. So I'm all in. I think 12 wins. I think the schedule sets up nicely, and the whole world will be watching October 8th when Texas A&M and then go to battle.
There you go, Ja'Cory Brooks. Andrew putting his ticket in right now. I wonder if there was a ticket preseason for odds of Devontae Smith a couple years ago when he won the Heisman as well. So, Drew, let's go to Ohio State now to Big Ten country. The over-under for them, 11. And our producer, Jesse, changed the over-under win total before the show. So I kind of went back and forth on this one a little bit. But I'm going to say they're in a push. I have them at 11-1 right now. But you look at Ohio State's schedule and how it sets up for them. It's pretty favorable. The first 5 games at home in Columbus, and then you got to go on the road at Michigan State. I think they'll be ready for that one. Then you get a bye. You got Iowa, and then at Penn State. I think that Penn State game is the one that I have circled. If there was going to be a potential trip up for Ohio State and the Buckeyes, that's where it would be. But C.J. Stroud coming back, Trevion Henderson, I think he's going to be even better in year 2. Jackson Smith and Najigba. We've talked a lot about the receivers, Emeka Egbuka being one of them. There's no shortage of firepower on the offensive side of the ball. But, Drew, I know this is what you brought up earlier in the show. What are they going to look like defensively? I think they're going to be more experienced. I think they're going to be able to hold it together. I say 11-1 for the Buckeyes in the regular season.
So I'm actually going under here, and I'm sure that's going to raise some eyebrows. And look, Ohio State defensive side of the ball, that has been an issue recently. They go and bring in Jim Knowles to be the defensive coordinator. And again, he's coming in with a new system. I was looking at that 2 deep, and yes, there's some talent. They're dealing with some injuries right now. And I think they're getting some guys like Lathan Ransom back. I believe he was practicing this week. I read that somewhere, or maybe it was on Bucknuts. I just worry about it. The pass defense, number 122 in the country 2 years ago. This past season, they were 96th in the country. So, I think the schedule, they face some talented quarterbacks, maybe not talented, but some quarterbacks that can win some games. Sean Clifford, that Penn State game, Tua's brother at Maryland, and then Michigan at the end, whether that's J.J. McCarthy or whatnot. So I have them at 10-2 right now. I know that's going to have some people a little bit upset, but I do think that there are some potential speed bumps on that schedule.
All right, there you have it. So I'm going to push. Drew's going to go under on Ohio State. All right, Drew, Georgia now 11 wins over under. I'm going to let you take the first crack at this one.
Yeah, I'm going over here. I mean, Georgia, the 15 players selected NFL record in the most recent NFL draft. I just look at this schedule and it just doesn't seem to be all that difficult. Yes, Oregon, they faced them in Atlanta week 1, but man, is Kentucky the hardest road game on here? I guess South Carolina. I mean, I just think this sets up where Georgia can kind of go in cruise control under Stetson Bennett. And I'll say this, everyone's probably going to ask about all the talent they lost on the defensive side of the ball, but man, it seems like me and you are always hyping up what they're bringing in. And when I was talking with some people in Nashville, the name that kept coming up was Nyckoles Williams, the former 5-star defensive end. He's on campus, and there's reason to believe he's potentially going to play as a freshman. And, Jalen Carter, Nolan Smith, Keely Ringo, I mean, those are all former 5-star prospects. And then obviously on the offensive side of the ball, you got Brock Bowers. So I don't expect Georgia to take any type of step back. Give me them 11-1. I think they could push, but I lean to the over.
I just think back to the former record of players drafted before Georgia this past year at 15. That was LSU in 2019, their national championship team. And listen, I'm not putting Ed Orgeron in the same breath of Kirby Smart. I'm not getting ready to do that. But I went back and I looked at the schedule a little bit. The two games that kind of stick out to me are week 3 at South Carolina. I think Spencer Rattler, Austin Stogner, you got a confident team there. And if that's a night game, that's going to be a game. That is one of the most difficult places in the country to play. I think South Carolina will be ready to roll for that one. But this Florida game, that has always just been a very interesting game to me. It's always had this very clunky feel. Even when there's been a favorite on either side of it, that game has just a little bit of unexpectedness to it. So I got that one circled as well. But I'm with you. I'm gonna say Georgia 11 wins. They'll lose 1 somewhere in the regular season, but I can't bet against Kirby Smart, what they brought in. And looking at the schedule again, I think that kind of sets up pretty nice for them. But Drew, now let's go to another team, and that will be number 4, Clemson. And this is going to be a really interesting one. We've talked a lot about DJ Uiagalelei, Cade Klubnick, one of the best quarterbacks in the country last cycle in the class of 2022. Last year, I think we've talked about it plenty. DJ Uiagalelei was not the only factor in terms of Clemson's struggles, if you want to call it that. There are a lot of issues up front. The receiving core was definitely a lot of room for improvement. But Drew, they're over/under win total at 10.5 right now. I'd be interested to see what you think on this one.
I'm going under here, and I think it's a difficult schedule for Clemson. I mean, we'll get into a second the personnel and the coaching, but at Wake Forest, I mean, that's week 4. Wake Forest returns a ton of talent, and then you go to NC State. Look at the back end as well at Notre Dame, Louisville, Miami, and improved South Carolina schedule. So I see some losses here for Clemson, who probably has the top defensive line in the country and one of the nation's best linebackers right behind them in Trent Simpson. Look, I like a lot of pieces that Clemson has across the board, but I think depth is certainly a concern. And then let's not forget, he lost both of his coordinators. His defensive coordinator and his offense coordinator are no longer at Clemson. I think that could play a factor. I do agree with you, and I'm sure you're going to bring this up. Cade Klubnick, the former 5-star quarterback who me and you love, talked about him potentially playing as a true freshman. I don't think you would be surprised if he got some action in 2022, correct?
Yeah, let's make a little side bet here, Drew, because that's what this show is all about. So Cade Klubnick, if you were a betting man, you're saying, okay, where does Cade Klubnick potentially get his first start? And you look at the schedule, you look at Georgia Tech, Furman, Louisiana Tech. And I look back and went all the way back to 2018 when Trevor Lawrence was a freshman. And certainly some of it had to do with Kelly Bryant suffering an injury earlier in the season. But Trevor Lawrence was getting some run. I think Dabo Swinney at that point knew he had something there, and he wanted to pull the curtain back and kind of see if it was real and if it would stand the test of time. So I kind of look at this similarly. You got Furman, Louisiana Tech earlier on the schedule. I would not be surprised by week 3 if we got a pretty good idea of where this conversation is shaping it up. And then I think by week 5, heading into week 6 at Boston College, I think you're going to have a pretty good idea of who the starter is going to be for the rest of the season when you're going into week 6 on the road against Jeff Hafley. Okay,
so you're going over under 6 is am I right here?
I would say over under, let's call it 4.5. So at Wake Forest.
I'm going over because I think it'll come with that bye week, if you go back to that schedule, I could see them trading back and forth quarterbacks. I mean, I think Dabo, if he can, he's going to do it earlier. But that bye week, look, after the Syracuse game, before that Notre Dame game, and I talked about that 4-game stretch at the end. You go up to South Bend to face the Irish. A hungry Louisville team comes to town after that. And then Miami's going to be fired up, and that leads right into your game against your rival, South Carolina. So, I mean, I don't think in the ideal world it goes that long, but by the bye week, I think Cade might have separated himself if that is the case, and that would make perfect sense as to when to do it.
Yeah, I'm going to go under as well on Clemson. I think they'll drop one within the first 6 weeks, whether that's Wake Forest, NC State, or Boston College. And you talked about that last 4-game stretch right there. Notre Dame, Louisville, Miami, South Carolina. I mean, those teams are very much improved. At Notre Dame is kind of the game that I got circled. I think Miami, Mario Cristobal every year loves being the underdog. I got that game circled as well. So I'm going to go under on Clemson. But Drew, let's round this out with Texas A&M and Jimbo Fisher, 8-4 season last year. A lot of expectations coming in with a historic recruiting class. The talent, a lot of these freshmen are going to be leaned on to contribute early. They're over under right now, 8.5 wins for the regular season. Which way are you leaning on the Aggies?
I'm leaning under, and again, that's probably one that's going to surprise people. But man, this schedule is certainly not easy. I mean, App State is one of your out of conference games. App State has had Power 5 teams numbers as of late. I mean, last year against Miami, they only lost by 2 points. A few years ago, they took Penn State to double overtime on the road. And then obviously we know what they did against Michigan years and years ago. I just look at the schedule and it's difficult. I mean, we don't know who's going to be under center for the Aggies. And yes, I think you brought it up. I mean, a lot of that 2022 recruiting class is going to be leaned on to play valuable, meaningful snaps. And to me, this just feels like a team that's probably a year away from getting where they want to be, from being 10-2, from being 11-1. And, Arkansas, that's a team that beat Texas A&M last year. Miami, that's going to be a monster game, 9 p.m. kickoff at Kyle Field. And then you got to go to Alabama at South Carolina. So I don't think the schedule sets up very well or Texas A&M. I mean, this is as difficult of a schedule as it can get.
I love A&M and the pieces that they have, but ultimately for me, this comes down to quarterback play. I don't know where you're going to get that from, whether that's Haynes King or Max Johnson. I think Johnson was a little bit more inconsistent last year. I don't blame him with the issues that LSU had under Ed Orgeron last year in Baton Rouge. I think that was a difficult position for him to be in. But you talk about that schedule, Drew, and you start looking at it. I mean, App State, Miami, and then Arkansas in Jerry World in Dallas. And I think Arkansas is going to be a very difficult out this season as well. At Mississippi State, a team they lost to. I think Alabama has the Aggies zeroed. We all know about that offseason talk between Nick Saban and Jimbo Fisher. And then here's the other one, at USC. To me, USC is either going to get Georgia or Texas A&M. I'm going to put my money on Texas A&M. And then look at this stretch here. Ole Miss, Florida, at Auburn. You got UMass, and then you got LSU. LSU has been very difficult for Texas A&M to handle. And you talk about LSU as a team with talent. I know there's not these high, lofty expectations right now, but I can see them being an 8 to 9 win team in the SEC West that by that point in December, I think they're going to be playing their best football, late November. So Texas A&M, as exciting as the talk is surrounding their program right now with all the talent that they have on their roster, you're like, okay, 8.5 win total. I'm going under, both you and I. So it's going to be interesting to see this play out and if they can exceed expectations. It also wouldn't surprise me, and this might sound like an out here, that if they're a double-digit win team, and also a factor maybe when it comes to the CFP as well. So we'll see. I mean, that is how high the ceiling is for Texas A&M and how low the floor can be at the same time. So we'll see what we get from Texas A&M and Jimbo Fisher and the Aggies come this fall. But Drew, final thoughts. I'm going to let you kick this one off. I know you like to talk about our guy who escaped Area 51, so I'm going to let you talk a little bit more about our boy Nyckoles Harbor.
Well, I'm sure you saw it over the weekend. Nyckoles Harbor, the 5-star athlete, 5-star freak out of the Washington, D.C. area. He won an AAU Junior Olympic title in the 200-meter dash. More importantly, he went a personal best 10.22 in the 100-meter dash. And this guy is he's an animal. He's a lock for my freaks list. And, I was doing some research on Nyckoles over the weekend, just kind of looking at his times and tracking football.com, Cooper, which I know you love. They do these PAI scores, right? So it takes everything into account, height, weight, speed, what sports you play in high school, everything, all that stuff. Nyckoles Harbor has a perfect 5.0 PAI score. You know who else had a perfect 5.0 PAI score? Micah Parsons, the do-it-all defender for the Dallas Cowboys, who went in the first round of the NFL draft. And Brian Doan, our colleague, recently reported that Nyckoles Harbor is leaning towards playing offense at the next level. We'd love to see him on defense. So Nyckoles, if you ever get part of this footage, we like you on that defensive side of the ball. Think you're the next Micah Parsons, because I think it could work out.
This is every show that I feel like we are pleading to Nyckoles Harbor to play defense, but hey, to each their own. Joe, I'm going to go with Jordan Davis. This viral clip throughout over the weekend, Jordan Davis, first round pick of the Philadelphia Eagles at pick number 13, a former All-American for the Georgia Bulldogs on their national championship team. But look at Jordan Davis walking back Jason Kelsey, all-pro center for the Philadelphia Eagles. That is a grown man. This is Preps to Pros, and we get to talk about this a lot. And Trey Scott, one of our favorite people at 247 Sports, was asking me, it was like, will we see another guy like this in the next 5 years? Short answer is no. You look at what Jordan Davis did at the NFL Combine, 6'6", 341, 4.78 40 at 340 pounds. It's just ridiculous. 32-inch vert and a 10.3 broad jump. So Jordan Davis, there you have it. And if you're a Philadelphia Eagles fan, you got to be ecstatic that guy fell to you at number 13. And the Georgia Bulldogs, and Drew, I was kind of thinking about this a little bit. These are two guys that I know you're familiar with, but you look at what they've done already. Jamal Jarrett already in the boat from the state of North Carolina. I know there's been some comps there. We said kind of slow it down on the comps. But another guy out there that I kind of thought, okay, there's some similarities. Jordan Hall, a guy that you're familiar with from the state of Florida.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jordan Hall, what's scary about him is he hasn't really been in a weight room. He's playing at Jacksonville West Side, and they do have a weight room and a program and all that stuff. But, man, it's completely different when you get to an SEC school. So, yeah, I kind of love that one. I'll just say this about the Jordan Davis clip. Dude, that looks like a scout team player. Like, I had no idea that was an all-pro center that he's just kind of pushing aside. But that's definitely awesome to see. I think one of the best parts about the preseason is just seeing what some of these guys that have been hyped up for the NFL draft, what they do. And we're going to kind of have the same thing here with the high school football season starting. And, it's going to be real interesting to just watch from a distance some of these kids start off their senior seasons and see who shoots up in the rankings. Because I'm going to tell you right now, it's absolutely going to happen.
Yeah, Jason Kelsey, a beer drinking war daddy, certainly getting into shape there in training camp. That's what it's for. Jordan Davis, bringing him to the tool shed there. But Drew, that is everything for today. We appreciate you guys joining in as always. And make sure, if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the 247 Sports YouTube page. Make sure you give us a like there as well. We will be back on Wednesday, 2 o'clock Central Time. Make sure you join us. And as always, we appreciate you guys tuning in to Preps to Pro. See you on Wednesday. Bye.